Number 5, this time we want to FOIL this expression and put it in standard form. So now we need to go into a little background on where this I comes from, because there are 4 iterations of this imaginary number that we need to learn about. So the I imaginary comes from taking the square root of a negative number, -1. So square root wants to know what number times itself will give you 1 or -1. Well, if I had +1 times +1, that would give us 1. And then if I did -1 times -1, I would still end up with a +1. Either case, if I'm multiplying a number times itself, it's going to end up positive. So there's no way that I can multiply the same number times itself and get a negative. So we've figured out a way to still be able to solve this. We take this negative out and we just call it imaginary. So it becomes an I, and then we evaluate the square root of 1, which is just 1. So we just end up with I. So I comes from the square root of -1. Now, there are 4 stages of this. There is I squared, there is I cubed, and then there's I to the 4th. Okay, so I squared comes from just taking square root of -1 and then squaring it. So if you square a square root, it gets rid of it, and so I squared is ultimately equal to -1. Okay, because that square root will cancel out, you'll end up with -1. So I squared is equal to -1. When you do I to the 3rd, it would be the same thing. If you think about exponents, say I had an x squared times x. So that's like to the 1st power. When you multiply the same base, you add the exponents. 2 plus 1 will give you 3. So that gives you x to the 3rd. So I'm just trying to show you shorthand here. So in order to get I to the 3rd, I would just multiply -1 times I. So these two. And that will give you a negative I. Okay, because the square root of -1 is equal to I. That's how we get I in the beginning. And if we multiply this and this, we get this times this, which just gives you -I. And then I to the 4th, you can think about that as like x squared times x squared, which is x to the 4th. So I squared times I squared, or -1 times -1, will just give you a +1. So these are the 4 stages, the 4 iterations of I. This is I squared, is this, and then it's just I, like you don't need that -1. So we have I squared, which is -1, I cubed, which is -I, and I to the 4th, which is 1. And then if we went to I to the 5th, it would just start over. 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and it just counts. So higher powers still simplify to one of these 4. So it's important to know that this is probably one of the most important that you need to remember. This will pop up a lot. We're going to be using that one here. I squared is -1. So with this problem now, we're going to FOIL this out. -6 plus I, -6 minus I. Now, if you notice the difference of squares, look, same number, -6, -6, I, we got a plus and a minus. So that middle term changes. I'm just going to do the shortcut, but you're welcome to FOIL it out and distribute and simplify. You should get the same thing. But the difference of squares says, oh, this is going to be equal to the first number squared, so -6 minus the second number squared, which is I. That's the shortcut when you're doing difference of squares. Alright, negative 6 squared, negative times a negative is a positive, so we get a positive 36. And then I squared is just going to be I squared for now. Now, above, we talked about I squared is equal to negative 1, so we're going to replace that. 36 minus I squared, which is a negative 1. Negative times a negative, or minus a negative, becomes plus. So we get 36 plus 1. And ultimately we get 37 as our answer. And just for the sake of showing, let me FOIL it out just so you see we get the same thing. 6 times 6, or negative 6 times negative 6 gives me 36. Negative 6 times negative I gives me a positive, because negative times a negative is a positive. So I get positive 6I. Done with that guy. I times negative 6 minus 6I. And then I times negative I minus I squared. Alright, positive 6I, negative 6I, opposites, they will cancel. So you end up 36 minus I squared, which is where I started, and then from there it'll be the same. Okay. So 37 is our answer in this case.